Miigwech, okay? When we came together in a solidarity pact for all the public sector unions several years ago to have a common front for bargaining and to get something out of the previous government, it was unprecedented. And of course, that morphed into a solidarity pact or a common front for us to change government. Now imagine that. The Public Service Alliance of Canada, okay, being a militant union bent on changing government. Now, some people have said, never in 100 years would you see that. We were a union that was organized to collectively bargain, get good contracts, etc. But to change government, that's not the role of a public sector union now, is it? But when you elect conservatives like we did, I think that it became quite apparent that we had no choice. Because the agenda is quite clear to us here. How clear it is to the Canadian public is another thing entirely. I was on the streets the day before the election. And I'm going through the streets of Ottawa South because we've been told that this is a very crucial riding and we've got to knock on doors and all the rest, so we're doing it. And being myself, I'm going down the street and I'm saying, don't forget to vote tomorrow. Vote, vote, vote. And then I'd be saying, vote NDP too, don't forget. And someone who obviously was working in a service industry, probably a hotel, he was already dressed, going to work, and said, what do you mean vote NDP? And he had an accent. I can't tell you where it was from, but I know that this person is probably a new Canadian, and said, no, 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 no. I vote Conservative. I said, why are you going to vote Conservative for? Because he's going to lower my taxes. And then I had to say, but what about the $2,000 raise you're going to get in January 1st if you vote NDP? And that blank stare comes across. What are you talking about? And I think that's what the real issue is. I really think that as we go through, you know, all the different problems we have, okay, it really is about the economic centrality of the public sphere. Not only can we hire people and give them good wages and good jobs and good benefits if in the public sector, but we pass legislation as well, which makes lives so much better for people, okay? And passing that minimum wage legislation, I mean, there's no way that that person's going to get a $2,000 tax cut from Doug Ford. But the $2,000 wage increase is there. In fact, it was a $5,000 wage increase that was passed the year before, going from $11.60 to $14. People don't talk in those terms, though. So we're not really connecting. And we didn't, because the NDP only lost by a little bit more than 400,000 votes. There's 1 million people in Ontario working at $14 an hour at minimum wage. 1 million! And I can guarantee you that we didn't get 1 million of them out to vote. Some of them were like, you know, I got no time to vote. What do you mean? I got 3 different jobs that I'm going to. Okay? So I think that we know where all the problems are, okay? But this whole propaganda that we've been told over the past 30 years, public sector, are you kidding me? You go up to somebody and you say that the solution is more government, not less government, and I guarantee you that you've lost the argument. You've lost it already. You've lost the attention, because then they're going to just look at you and say, well, you're just preaching for your own parish. You're preaching for your own neck of the woods. So the big challenge is, how do we get that message out there? And very often I think that it's to a large extent that sometimes we don't totally understand it ourselves. How many of you in this room have worked in the private sector in management, corporate private sector management? Raise your hand. With you two and me, it makes 3. And I can tell you that the 6 years that I spent in the corporate private sector, working for one of the biggest conglomerates in this country, is probably the best experience I have for knowing what the enemy is talking about. I'm not telling you all to go start working in the corporate private sector. Far from it. But if you haven't been in a board meeting, and especially if you haven't been around a table with a conference call with the boys from Wall Street asking you for this quarter, how are you going to exceed the performance that you had in the last quarter so that we can have a buy instead of a hold or a sell on your stock price? Believe me, that can be some of the most seriously stressing shit you can put up with. And that's why I didn't stay, of course. But these people aren't fooling around. It's about profits. It's not about serving customers. It's not about making sure that 10 years from now we'll have the greatest reputation. No, absolutely not. And I think that we all know that it really is about this insatiable greed for profits that says we absolutely need to bring the tax rate down for corporations from 30%, where it was in 1999, when I was working in the corporate sector. And the profitable companies told me, we don't care about the taxes. And it was true, they didn't. Because they only pay taxes on profit. That means that by the time you've plugged every single last expense, it's whatever's left after that, including those corporate bonuses that they're paying. And they still want the tax rate to go down to 10% at the federal level if those conservatives are reelected. And in fact, the liberals, you got to watch them. You got to watch them, because if you're not watching them, they'll slip it in there too. So one of the things that I was looking at and discussing, working on this speech, is that increasingly poverty, marginalization, low wage rates, and everything that ensues from it increasingly has a color. You know, I go through Ottawa, and I like to drive by some of the neighborhoods, and I'm shocked sometimes, because I remember when I moved to Ottawa back in 71, 72 into the area, there wasn't an elementary school that you'd go by and you'd see a black kid. I was 14, I was looking. Where's somebody that looked like me in Ottawa? Believe me, they were diplomats, sons of engineers, doctors, professionals. We didn't have the wave of immigration that we have today. You go to schools today, and you look at the schoolyards. Wow. There I am. Much older today, but I'm looking at these schoolyards and I'm saying, holy mackerel. And then you'll turn on the TV, or you'll go on Facebook, and you'll hear, why the hell should I be paying taxes? If you're going to lower my taxes, I like that, because I don't want to pay for all of those people. And you know it's true. You know it's true. We hear it all the time. I don't hear it as much. But my spouse is white. And I can tell you he hears it. He hears it very easily because he is white. And some people will think that he thinks the way they do. They'll always be a bit more reserved with me. But if I bring it up, you know, it don't take you that long to find out that when we have people who are in low-paying, precarious work, that means our new Canadians. It also means not so new Canadians who haven't been able to move up. It also means LGBT folks The propaganda that LGBT folks are a bunch of people who got all kinds of money to go on cruises all year is bullshit. I know. I'm telling you. Some of the poorest folks in this city are a stone's throw away from here. LGBT. Thank God they're living in Quebec. Because the social net here for people who are earning $12 an hour minimum wage, a lot of whom are working for tips, okay, is better. Because even though we put it up to 14 in Ontario, I said, well, you know what? In Ontario, they're paying a little bit more, not to mention childcare. So when we're talking about what it is that we have to do, when you talk about services like childcare, when I heard this morning people talk about universal, public, not-for-profit childcare, what's wrong with that? Why is that a problem? When we have so many people who talk about children. You know, we get very, very, very upset. Separating kids at the border, down below. Could it happen here? Who knows? But I know that there are people up here who think that that's a good idea. Because if you do that, hey, you know what? The word will spread down through Mexico, down into Guatemala and all the rest. Don't even think about coming up here. We'll take your kids away from you. Okay? So when we look at how this marginalization is working and who it's affecting, we are creating a subclass of people in this country. And that subclass of people will not be able to extricate themselves from that condition. And that's exactly what the agenda is with the private sector corporate. As long as we can have all these people who can't make more than minimum wage, that's fine. And by the way, did you hear that argument about the minimum wage at the Ontario election? This was the kicker for me. The disabled folks who had to get a minimum wage now under the legislation where they were getting $4 or $5 an hour before. Their own families complaining because it meant that they would be out of a job. So since when does being disabled mean that you're only worth $4 an hour? And that you can do this on the radio, and I'm not seeing or hearing anybody getting upset about that. And it was something that was discussed in this election, that Ms. Wynne, when she put up the minimum wage, there should have been an exemption. And then you talk to people about stuff like that, the minimum wage. And you know what? $14 is too much. So what should it be? It should be less. 10, 9, 8. You know, it doesn't take too long before we go back to what we had in the 19th century. Sure was nice when we had them slaves. I'd just sit on my veranda and sip back my mint julep. In Haiti, my mother used to tell me stories about when she was down there living, and she gave her cook $40 a month in 1955, which is about 4 times more than everybody else gave in that class. That class, that elite class. I can tell you that if you give people $5 minimum wage, there'll still be people complaining about it. They'd rather give nothing. So that's why when we are going to be promoting public, when we are going to say we're stopping to talk about defending public services, it's no longer about defending, because that's where eventually this is going to end up. This bullying that we had for 10 years, and brothers, you know what I'm talking about, every time that government came in with another regulation, with another policy that kept pushing us back, and we'd come back and we'd say, we've got to defend quality public services. Hell, defend. Because when you push back, you'll eventually fall out the window. We got to push back now. And not only push back for everything that they took, but we got to push back to get where we should have been in the first place. And that is up to us. That is up to us to do. I wanted to use the term entrepreneur, but that don't do it. Because as much as I can't stand it, when I was at Statistics Canada in the 80s arguing against changing the terminology for personnel to human resources, that made no sense. I said, I'm not a resource. I'm human. But if you start treating me like a resource, then I'm a thing. I'm just a debit and a credit. And that's exactly what's happened in society. It's not about personnel anymore. It's not about human beings. You're expendable. You're a cost item. So I don't like using this private sector terminology, when we talk. But we need to be more entrepreneurial in pushing and promoting and expanding public services than they ever could be in the private sector. And let me tell you something else from my experience in the private sector. Now, I'll end on this. Anybody who tells me, oh, public servants, lazy, they don't work, they have master's degrees and looking busy all day and doing nothing. Well, you know what? I used to supervise 200 folks in the private sector as an executive vice president. And it was just as bad. If you're incompetent or if you're fundamentally lazy, it doesn't matter where the hell you work. It really doesn't. If you want to look busy, you'll look busy. You'll have them running in circles playing games with people all day. All right? I have seen some of the hardest working people right in the public sector, where I have spent most of my career, where I came back 3 times after leaving to go into the private sector, thinking that the grass was greener on the other side. Okay? So I can tell you that in the public sector, we have great people, and we have people who can do the job, and that includes Phoenix. Should have done that ourselves in the first place. And there is nothing more parasitic, as far as I'm concerned, than a company like IBM sitting back, knowing that the shit's going to hit the fan, but you know what? Don't say anything. We're more interested in the contract than we are in having a bunch of happy customers. Because everybody's pissed off at IBM now. What's the cost of that? Okay? So let's go out there and let's make sure that we not only promote public services, that we promote the public economy, which is at the center of our economic structure in this country, if not the world. Let's make sure that we expand it. Let's make sure that we get the message out there that this is the way to go, because the other way is quite simply unsustainable. And the people are willing to listen to that, but we've got to make sure that we get the message out clearly and so that they can understand when they're not voting in their best interests. So on that, thank you very much for having me here. Merci beaucoup. Miigwech. Okay?